Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. And I'm your host, Mike Allen. We're going to revisit a pretty difficult chapter in U.S. history today, a chapter that played out largely in New Haven, Connecticut. The imprisonment and trials of enslaved captives from Africa who had conducted a mutiny of the crew aboard the Spanish ship La Amistad captured international attention back in the year 1840. Now, it was one of the milestone steps on that very long road to ending slavery, and in fact, Steven Spielberg made the movie Amistad in the late 1990s about this incredible case. We've got two representatives from the New Haven Museum here to discuss this very important case today. Jason Bischoff-Wurzel is director of the museum's photo archives collection, and Joanna Steinberg is Director of Learning and Engagement for the museum. Together, they compiled an excellent exhibit that revisits the case with updated information. They're going to be along in just a moment to speak about this case. This week's trivia question: this woman from Easton was a celebrated author and lecturer, but she couldn't see, hear, or talk. Who was she? Stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you're going to know the topic for next week's show. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is brought to you by our sponsor, Yale New Haven Health. When people need the best quality health care, there's a reason they turn to Yale New Haven Health. In 1826, Yale New Haven Hospital became Connecticut's very first hospital. They were the first hospital in the U.S. to use chemotherapy. Yale New Haven was the first to introduce insulin pumps for diabetic patients, and they introduced the world's first intensive care unit for newborns. For more information about Yale New Haven Health, visit ynhhs.org. That's ynhhs.org. Well, in order to truly appreciate today's episode, we've got to take a quick look at the issue of slavery back in the early 1800s. At that time, the world was finally starting to come to terms with the slave trade issue, and international treaties were drafted that banned the practice, and the U.S. banned the importation of slaves in 1808. But in the U.S., owning slaves already in the country was up to individual states, and of course the Civil War would come along in a couple of decades to settle that issue. In 1839, when today's story begins, slavery was still legal in Connecticut. It wouldn't be totally phased out until 1848. But it had been banned in neighboring New York, and that comes into play in today's story. Now, even though slavery was not illegal yet in Connecticut, there were efforts to support abolition or the ending of slavery all over the state. Two such efforts of note were the opening of the first school for black females only in Canterbury, started by Prudence Crandall, who's the state heroine, you may know. She faced a number of setbacks in her efforts, including arson at her school, her personal arrest, and the harassment of her students. She closed the school after only a short period of time. And in New Haven, the first college for all black males in this country had been proposed, but it was shot down by a very wide margin by the citizenry. Now, on the international stage, Cuba was still a country that was relying on slaves. You may know they have a lot of sugarcane plantations there, and they had an abundance of them then, and they wanted slaves to work on those plantations. So in 1839, Portuguese sailors illegally carried a number of black Africans across the Atlantic in a ship called the Takora. Included on that ship were 53 Africans from the country of Sierra Leone, which is on Africa's west coast. The Portuguese were taking these captives to Havana, Cuba, where they were to be sold into slavery for use in Cuba's sugarcane industry. Well, after that slave auction, the 53 Africans, which, by the way, included 4 children, were placed on a smaller boat owned by Spain, a schooner called La Amistad. The ship was to carry those enslaved Africans from Havana a relatively short distance to the final destination of Puerto Príncipe, also in Cuba. Well, 2 people have studied this story and, in fact, have created a great exhibition about it at the New Haven Museum. Are the museum's director of photo archives, Jason Bischoff-Wurzel, and the museum's director of learning and engagement, Joanna Steinberg. So, Jason and Joanna, let's start off at the beginning, back in Sierra Leone on the west coast of Africa. Now, these poor captives, and I guess there were, 53 of them in all, including 4 children, they were just going about their daily lives in their home country, right, Jason?
Yes. So to kind of give context for the story, they were actually from all different backgrounds, villages, and kind of just taken from your average life. Say you're walking down the street and basically literally you're kidnapped, and you were brought together into large groups and then loaded onto the Takora, which was a illegal slave ship at that point, and then brought to the New World. They were just free people doing their thing, living their lives, and captured with the intent to be sold into slavery in the New World.
Just to add to that, they were highly skilled. Some were blacksmiths, rice farmers, weavers, merchants, hunters. And so when they're brought over and trafficked through the Atlantic slave trade, this was happening illegally. Because of foreign treaties that were outlawing the slave trade, this was happening in practice anyway. So they're brought over to Havana. 53 of those individuals who come off the Takora were trafficked and forced to relocate onto La Amistad. They're being trafficked across Cuba, and then that's where the revolt happens, off the shores of Cuba.
Now, the revolt itself occurred on La Amistad, not the larger Takora slave ship that had brought them from Sierra Leone to Cuba. La Amistad is a much smaller ship. It's a schooner, and it was owned by the Spanish, not the Portuguese. Now, after being kidnapped from Sierra Leone, these captives then were sold into slavery in Havana, and then were going to be transported to the sugarcane plantations in Puerto Príncipe. That's another location in Cuba. Now, on this trip on La Amistad, I guess they were bound in chains and they padlocked, and they actually had machetes on board that they were going to use to cut the sugarcane in the fields. And Joanna, I guess that suddenly one of the crew members, a guy named Celestino, did something that made them all nervous.
They're on La Amistad, and the cook on the schooner, Celestino, gestures that they're going to be killed in Eden. And horrified, one of the leaders of this revolt takes a nail, breaks open the padlocks of the chains. They, as a group, end up using the sugarcane knives, repurposing them, which would have been used in the exploitation of their labor on the plantations, and they use them to liberate themselves. And so when the revolt happens, they end up sparing the lives of the 2 Spanish enslavers who had navigational skills, who had committed to helping them return back to Sierra Leone, where they were from. They end up, by day, sailing eastwards towards the sun, towards Africa. By night, they were deceived and end up moving towards the coast of the United States. About 63 days later, the ship is seized in Long Island Sound by the U.S. Navy.
So there's a mutiny, and then this schooner is sailing around for, 2 months, 63 days, 2 months, and they finally get spotted and boarded by the U.S. Navy vessel, the Washington. Now, how is it that the U.S. Navy has a vessel that gets involved in a case involving Cuba and a Spanish boat?
There were reports by this point coming in of this kind of mysterious, quote, low schooner. So the Amistad had been seen off the coast and, basically went to investigate this. Because you have to think, after 63 days, it was supposed to go from one side of Cuba to the other. So it was looking a little ragged. It was on a known trajectory. So it was curiosity. Being that it was still international waters, it was time to kind of go in and pull a little closer to it and see what was going on, actually.
So I suppose it was pretty clear to the captain and the crew of the Washington what was going on there. I mean, obviously they had black captives there, right? They were being transported. There clearly had been a mutiny. The Spanish crew that was left over told them about that. There had been deaths on board. The Spanish crew, though, was lying, weren't they? They didn't mention that these captives had been kidnapped illegally in Sierra Leone. Of course, they wouldn't, offer that. Instead, they just said that they had been slaves in Cuba for a long time, were being taken to sugarcane plantations, and rose up and mutinied on the ship, right? So the captives, of course, didn't understand English, and they couldn't counter any of these arguments that were coming from the Spanish. So anyways, this zigzag sailing back and forth had taken them out to the eastern end of Long Island, right? Do I have that right? And the captain there could take them either to New York State, which would have been Long Island, or Connecticut. Joanna, why did they take them to Connecticut?
Slavery was already illegal in New York, and it was being gradually abolished, but still legal in Connecticut. So they were taken to Connecticut where profits could be made. They end up claiming salvage rights. They expected rewards for the recovery of this damaged ship, but also the property, which, as they argued in the courts, included enslaved people. There were also enslaved West Africans who were also killed in the revolt, too, I should add. So the 4 deaths: the captain, Ferrer, Celestino, the cook, a man by the name that they think is Duevi, and another individual whose name is not known.
Okay, so the legal proceedings are going to get pretty complex, right? There were 2 different legal issues that had to be resolved. Number 1 was, were they guilty of murder for killing the captain and the cook? And number 2, were they actually slaves, as the Spanish crew was claiming, or were they actually free humans who had been kidnapped illegally from their home in Sierra Leone? Now, just so people can understand this, I guess, back in those days in Connecticut, we had 2 capitals, Hartford and New Haven, and each had their own different courts. And the first case is going to occur in Hartford in state court to see if they were found guilty of murder. Joanna, I guess this got a little tense because the judge who's assigned to the case was the same man who had quite a history of racism, including in the case of the first all-black girls' school in Connecticut.
Andrew Jetson, who is a district court judge, appears at the hearing, and he already had a racist track record of opposing Prudence Crandall's School for African American Girls, and he tries them for murder and piracy, and that's at the point that they're brought through the judicial system in subsequent trials that last for nearly 2 years. They are brought to New Haven, and they're incarcerated here in New Haven for nearly 19 months.
Well, I suppose the good news for them was that they had been found innocent on all the murder charges. The ruling said that Connecticut didn't have jurisdiction there, right? It was a mutiny on a Spanish ship, and it happened in international waters, so Connecticut didn't have a say. So now they have to go back, though, for the legal challenge in New Haven, which is going to have a U.S. courthouse, not a state courthouse. And there the issue was going to be whether they were slaves or free. Now, I guess in the interim, they were anything but free, right? They're being held at the New Haven jail on Church Street in New Haven, which is right near the Central Green. And Jason, in Steven Spielberg's movie Amistad, this jail kind of looks like an underground dungeon, right?
The downtown jail, if you will, off the Green, was essentially a stable. This is also prior to a firm establishment of the New Haven Police Department. So, we didn't have necessarily jails, prisons, essentially. They were located initially off the Green, and this is where this idea of the media depictions come into play, that you could sort of create notoriety of some sort by having the captives there jailed right off the Green, because the jail keeper at that point would also actually charge people money to come and view the captives, and the captives would go out onto the Green and, essentially to get exercise and, stretch their legs. So, you'd be out essentially doing calisthenics. But this started feeding into this sort of media circus, if you will, that would surround the trial. And that's really important to kind of think about in that sense, in that context. This how things are placed into the news cycles and interpreted by the public has a hand in both politics and the judicial system.
The jail also becomes a center for organizing. There were abolitionists in New Haven like Simeon Jocelyn, who worked extensively with the Temple Street Congregational Church, one of the first black churches in New Haven. A group called the Amistad Committee is formed here, who fundraises for their legal defense. Many of these abolitionists, again, are meeting with the Amistad rebels in the jail, strategizing throughout the trials, trying to document their testimonies, recruiting an interpreter, James Covey, who's from a similar region of Sierra Leone, who's recruited in the trials to translate what had happened to them.
Well, it was a gold mine for the defense team to find this guy, Covey, so that he could translate the truth of the situation into English so that everybody in court could hear it and understand it. Jason, that was a little bit of a stroke of luck to actually find Covey, right?
In a nutshell, he was discovered in New York City by people associated with the trial. They'd heard a rumor of somebody who spoke a similar Mende dialect, and they were walking up and down the docks, yelling words out. Kind of lifted his head and responded. He was recruited to basically work as a translator in the trial itself.
Now, Joanna, despite the fact that slavery was not yet illegal in Connecticut, I guess the city of New Haven was kind of like an oasis that helped support those captives.
Yeah, New Haven was a site for abolition. And about 8 years before, in 1831, there was a proposal for what would have been the first HBCU in the country. This vote to form the first historically black college and university was struck down in a vote of 700 to 4. Some of those individuals who voted in support of the college were very deeply involved in the trials, including Roger Sherman Baldwin, who becomes the lead counsel.
Well, we'll return to Mr. Baldwin there in a minute, but first, what was the argument the Spaniards were making exactly in their claim that these Amistad rebels were in fact property that they owned?
They were denying the fact that they had been trafficked from West Africa, concealing that by claiming that they were longtime Cuban slaves, which they weren't. The Amistad rebels always talk about their origins, where they were from in Africa, how long they were in Cuba, and what the violence was on the Middle Passage.
Well, overall, it was a incredibly complicated legal proceeding. What they had 13 different dialects that they had to translate. But the Amistad rebels did prevail. They won their case for freedom, except that I guess the President of the United States himself got into the act.
Their freedom is first recognized in New Haven on the basis of evidence that foreign treaties had been violated. And then President Van Buren, who's up for re-election, is appealing to white Southerners and also being pressured by the Spanish government, has the case appealed. And that's ultimately when it goes up to the Supreme Court.
Well, let's now turn back to that Roger Sherman Baldwin. He's the grandson of the founding father, Roger Sherman, and Baldwin himself would go on not only being the lead defense counsel in this case, but he'd go on to become the governor of Connecticut. Now, he had some help in his corner on this legal case from yet another pretty prominent founding father.
John Quincy Adams is giving legal advice in the background throughout the trials, but he's really recruited to join the defense team during the Supreme Court trial.
This was clearly the twilight of his career, and he was very much involved to the point that, yes, he ended up basically coming out of retirement to act as a lawyer in the case.
So now, finally, this question of whether the Amistad rebels were Cuban slaves or free men kidnapped from Africa is now going to go before the highest court in the land. What happened there, Joanna?
As Jason mentioned, John Quincy Adams is also recruited, speaks very openly about President Van Buren subverting the legal process, going beyond his presidential duties. And so their freedom is recognized because there was a clear violation of foreign treaties. So it wasn't because of enlightenment or because of anti-slavery views. Half of these Supreme Court justices would go on to be part of the Dred Scott ruling that barred the abolition of slavery in the Western territories leading up to the Civil War.
So in any event, the Amistad rebels won their case, they won their freedom, but what they didn't have, I guess, was funding to buy a ticket on a boat to get back to Sierra Leone.
No one was held accountable for the circumstances and that they were illegally trafficked and brought through the Middle Passage. So there's trauma in the story, and there's no one held accountable for their return. But from the very beginning, the Amistad rebels were determined to reclaim their lives and return back to their homelands. They work with abolitionists. They end up going on a speaking tour to black and white churches across the Northeast for about 6 months, telling their stories.
And that helped them raise the money they needed to get back to Sierra Leone, which is just a great story. Now, they ended up traveling back with a couple of black missionaries from one of the churches in New Haven. What happened when they finally got back to their homeland?
Once they do return to Sierra Leone, about 2/3 of the group end up leaving within the first few months, attempting to reconnect with family, their villages, because they were from a vast region in Sierra Leone. About 1/3 stay with the missionary group, including the children, who adopt new names, Western names. There is a story of Margaret, one of the young girls, coming back actually to the United States and attending Oberlin College, one of the first integrated colleges in America, and then returning back to Sierra Leone as a teacher.
Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. You know, a replica of the original Amistad schooner has its home dock in New Haven Harbor. You can go there and see it, but warning, it's not often in port because it sails to various locations to conduct educational programs to raise awareness about this case. I want to thank our guests for today's program from the New Haven Museum, Jason Bischoff-Wursel, Director of the museum's photo archives, and Joanna Steinberg, Director of Learning and Engagement at the museum. The answer to this week's trivia question, the question was, this woman from Easton was a celebrated author and lecturer, but she couldn't see, hear, or speak. Who was she? Well, of course, it was Helen Keller, a resident of Easton, Connecticut for nearly 4 decades until her death. Next week on Amazing Tales CT, we take a look at Helen Keller's truly remarkable life, including those 40 years in Connecticut, and including her friendship with Samuel Clemens, better known, of course, as Mark Twain. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.